Hello my gorgeous makeup loving friends, happy Sunday. You know what that means. It's time for Swatching Sundays, but I'm doing something a little bit different this week. You may have noticed recently that Natasha Denona came out with their golden palette, and it's essentially like a revival, a reimagining of the OG gold palette. And I thought it would be quite interesting to compare both because I do have both of them. That is how long I have been a Natasha Denona fan. So part of this video is comparing the shades that are similar, the shades that are distinct, and looking at them across different lighting. And at the very end, I'm going to be talking about maybe the feeling of how they're different in terms of like formula, texture, etc. So if you find that interesting, if you're a bit of a nerd like me and want to know the differences between these two palettes, then this is the video for you. Do please keep on watching. I have both of the gold palettes here by Natasha Denona, and over here I have the OG gold palette. You can see it's a little bit different. It has its leather kind of encasing. It's quite different. And then over here we have the more recent golden palette. There are some similarities in terms of the shades that are in there. There's, I think, 8 shades that are similar and then 7 shades that differentiate between the two palettes. So when you open them, you see that both have mirrors, so it's pretty similar. It does look like you get a little bit more product, or at least the pan sizes are a little bit bigger in the OG, but this was much more expensive than this newer one. I believe this was like 100 and something euro, whereas this was like 69 euro. This is a point where I say that I'm an affiliate, blah, blah, blah. I have a code for money off, whatever. But also in this one, you don't have the names written underneath. It instead has this sort of plastic sheeting, which is a little bit annoying. I didn't love that. And they have the names printed here. This is also a little bit easier to remove and kind of change things around. So you can see that Natasha has kind of innovated so that it works better for her. And as I said, there are 8 shades which are similar to the two palettes. So what I want to do is swatch them to see if there's differences in maybe tones, in the performance of them from the OG to the newer one, because that's something I'm personally quite interested in. The way that I thought that this would make sense for me to do it is to do it a shade at a time and have the original palette over here on my left hand side and the newer palette over here on my right hand side. So I'm going to go first with the shades that are similar, i.e. they are named the same, to see if there's any sort of tonal differences. The first shade that we have is Aria, and on my index finger I have the OG palette, and on my middle finger I have the newer one. So this is the shade Aria, and you can see you're getting a lot of pigment even just with the original one, and that's saying a lot considering this is an older palette and I've had it for a while. And this is the new one. So I do believe that she kind of changed her formula a bit. This is not as warm leaning. I will build this up though to get it to full opacity. Then we have Cava, and you can kind of see here on the index finger, this looks a little bit more kind of silvery leaning gold, whereas the one in the middle is a little bit more yellow toned, and that's kind of the newer one. And this is the shade Cava. So again, this is the original gold palette, and then this is the golden palette. I do think you can see some pretty clear distinctions even amongst these shades. We then have the shade Oro, which is common across both palettes, but straight away, just eyeballing here, they look very different. So again, this is Oro from the original palette, and this is Oro from the newer palette, much more yellow toned, whereas this one is much more brassy. We then have the shade Log. I will say the two of these do seem quite similar across both palettes. So this is Log from the original palette, and this is Log from the newer palette. I will say this one seems a bit darker. There's more like black in this one than there is in the newer one. We then have the shade Varus, and I do feel like these look somewhat similar. In terms of the formula, I almost feel like the older formula was a bit creamier, which is really interesting. However, I know she's kind of changed things up a little bit to make it so that her formulas have like less parabens, etc. So that's a really interesting direction that she's gone into. So we have the old shade Varus here, and this is the new Varus. I feel like there's not much of a distinction between these two. We now have the shade Sandstone, and I feel like they look somewhat similar on the finger, but I can almost tell there's a little bit more yellow in the newer one. So this is the shade Sandstone from the original and the new Sandstone from the new palette. As I said, you can see this is a little bit more yellow leaning. Then there's the shade Alchemist. I think you can kind of see already that even though they're named the same, they do look a little bit different to each other. Do I think that there's a massive, massive difference? No, not really. I think that most people wouldn't notice the difference, and when it's on the eye, it's not going to be that clear. But when you see them next to each other, it is kind of obvious. So this is the shade Alchemist from the original and Alchemist from the new palette. Now we have the shade Teak, and this is it from the original palette and from the new palette. Again, you can kind of see I need to go over the original one, but that's because it's an older formula. It's been in my collection for a while, so we're not going to judge it. And the last shade that's common across both is Aurum, or Aurum, A-U-R-U-M. And this is it in the original and in the newer version. So those are the 9 shades that are in common. I said that there was 8. I lied. 9 shades. So there are 6 that are different. Obviously, within the original, we have a lot more blue tones, and in the newer one, it's much more neutral. So I'm going to go first with the original one and swatch kind of the remaining ones that are different there. And I mean, aren't these gorgeous? I am just sitting here being like, I am so glad that I managed to get this when I got this. I've been such a fan of Natasha for years. I think kind of having this in my collection kind of shows that. So we have Lime Chrome, Python, and Sparks. I mean, absolutely stunning. And then these are the last 3 shades of that palette that are unique to it. We have Aurora, Dijon, like a mustard, and Brass. But there are also shades that are unique to the new palette as well, so I'm going to swatch those. So these are the shades that we see that are different across here. So we see a lot more light shades that weren't included within the original. We have Milko, Nubia, and Panna. And these are the very last 3 shades that are unique to that palette. There's Fizzy, Aura, which is almost leaning back into the original palette, and Flesh. So those are both palettes swatched, and I think you can already see the distinctions of the older palette versus the newer palette. I definitely feel, and I'm not just saying this because I got both, that you can have both. You know, if you have the old one and are wondering, can I do with the new one? There are enough distinctions there that kind of indicate that. But let's remove this now. That's the big thing, so we can have a little look. I don't know about you, but I find this very satisfying. And again, you can see there is some amount of distinction between these here. So to let you have an idea, if you haven't watched Swatching Sundays before, at the moment I only have 1 ring light on and 2 box lights. I've no other source of light. This just gives you a good idea as to what the shadows look like, but I am going to show it in alternative lighting as well so that you can get a better idea. And now I just have a single ring light on to give you an idea as to what these look like. So again, as a reminder, this is the older palette and this is the new golden palette. I do feel like you can see that even the shades that are meant to be similar to each other, they're not super similar. Yeah, I'd say they'll look the same on the eye, but when they're swatched, there is enough of a distinction to be like, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. It is very interesting just to see them together. Maybe it's just me geeking out, but I find it interesting. Long-time viewers of Swatching Sundays will know exactly what this is. So I've turned off all lights and I'm going to have one source of light, which is a torch from my phone. So we can see some of the shimmers a little bit better. Again, this gives us slightly better indications as to what these look like and how they have performed. And particularly up at the top, so near the wrist, those are the ones that are meant to be similar to each other. and down at the bottom are the ones that are different to each other. So what I think is quite interesting is that right now I have one big light on, my ring light, and two box lights. And I feel like when you have all of these lights on, whatever differences there are between the similar shades almost washes out. This is the importance of looking at these things across different lighting. So I think this might be where like some of the similarities can be seen a little bit better. However, you know the general drill, I like to see this across different cameras as well. So I'm going to use my phone in similar lighting just to show you what the story is. So this is using my camera phone, and I do find it so interesting that when you have it swatched out like this, you can't see that much of a difference. Now I do feel the third shade down, it's almost a bit more metallic looking, a little bit more wet looking on the original. Same with the second one. It's almost like the newer version is a little bit more subtle. You can see some distinctions there even with the sixth shade down. One is more yellow, one is much more like bronzy, orangey, brassy. And then the shade beneath that as well. Again, there's some distinctions, which I just find really, really interesting, because there are definitely shades that do look very, very similar, but they don't all out dupe. And can we just talk about those final shades in the original gold palette? Like, they're so pretty. They need to bring those back out again. I think they're stunning. So now I'm just in front of a window. I don't have like direct light, so it's indirect light. And I again feel like this is giving a good idea as to the similarities and the distinctions across the two palettes. I'd like to think it's helpful. I think I hear Cece moving. Oh dear. Who knows? But I just can't get over how pretty those original shades are from the gold palette. I have had this, I think, since 2018. So it's like 6 years old. And it still performs perfectly. Natasha, damn you and your fabulous, fabulous formulas. And now we're in a space where I have no direct light at all. I have no lights on. I'm just in my kitchen. Can you tell I like the colour green? And again, you can kind of see that she's kept things quite similar. Can we all start a petition to bring back the original, the OG gold though, those blue tones? Because they're so interesting. Like, look at that lime chrome one. She was innovating before the rest of the world figured out how to do it. Like, ridiculous. Can you tell why I love Natasha? Did I need to get the new palette? No, but you can see there are some like distinctions across them, and I am a Natasha ho. But I want to see this outside to see if there's any differences in terms of the sparkle and the shimmers that it's giving. Anyways, we actually have sunshine, and this is what it looks like. You can really see, they do look very similar. I almost feel like the newer side, so that's over on the right hand side, has like a more subtle shimmer, whereas like the shimmer from the left hand side, the original, it's almost indicative of the time, that more metallic bam in your face, whereas now we like to have more like sparkles, more diffused sparkliness. But let us look at the distinct shades. I think those are really interesting. I'm very sorry about the wind. Believe it or not, I can't control that. Or maybe I can. And I'm just fucking with you. Who knows? But I think it's really nice. But more importantly, look at her. That's one of the strays. She's such a good girl. She's like, she wants cuddles more than she wants food sometimes. And she wouldn't let me come near her originally. We have made progress. Anyways, I think that's really pretty, but I'm going to show it to you on my phone as well to get some more angles. So again, I have the original on the left hand side, the newer one on the right hand side, and when you're outside you really can't see that much of a difference. So, you know, it's going to be up to you as to whether or not you feel like getting the newer one is necessary. Again, those are the newer shades. Here's Cece, not impressed about torting. Anyways, you can really see the distinctions here. So let's talk about the differences across these two palettes. I think that even though the colour story is somewhat similar, you can see how some of them are slightly different in terms of their tones. Some are a little bit more grey, some are a little bit more orange leaning, based upon whichever palette you're discussing. And I can kind of understand why that occurred, because there's a very, very clear formula difference from the OG to the newer one. The biggest thing that I noticed is that you get a lot more pigment with this. Now, on the surface, you'll say, but Teresa, surely that's better. Not necessarily. More pigment basically means that it's harder to disperse, it has a drier formula, it's a little bit more tricky to work with. So while this technically is more pigmented straight off the bat, it is a little bit more tricky to work with. You need a little bit more nuance, a little bit more finesse, and it is a drier formula for the mattes. When you're looking at those sort of shimmery shades, they're an awful lot more creamy. And I think the reason why they're a bit more creamy is, again, this is almost a remnant of the time. It is more pigmented. So they've put way more pigment in there, and so that the shimmers aren't crazy dry, they've added a lot more of like an emollient in there. So that's why it feels a little bit different. Now, when we look at this newer palette, the gold palette, this is a lot softer. It almost feels lighter to the touch, whereas this feels almost like a little bit more chunky on the eye. Definitely feels like a more elevated sort of a formula, and that makes sense. I mean, there's essentially 6 years of a difference in terms of the manufacturing time. Yes, I am working with an older palette, so we also have to remember, you know, things can go off, etc. But there's no smell, there's no mold. It's totally fine to still use. But you can see how much the formula has actually changed. It's a lot lighter. It's almost indicative of the kind of Asian beauty that we see. Very light, very subtle, very, very buildable. So this is nowhere near as dry a formula. Is it as pigmented off the bat? No, but it's buildable. And for an MUA, that makes a huge amount of sense, because that's what a lot of MUAs will want, is something that doesn't necessarily give you pigment straight off the bat, because when you get a bunch of pigment straight off the bat, it's very difficult to work with. You're going to be spending a lot of time blending, diffusing, whereas this, you can really gradually build it up. You have an awful lot more control over the end look that you actually have. So you can feel like there's not the same amount of pigment, but it's buildable. It's a lot more satiny sort of a formula, I guess is the best way to look at it. Nowhere near as drying. You get a much more subtle, it's almost like more finely grained when it comes to like the shimmers. It's a lot more elevated, I suppose, is the way of looking at this. In terms of the colour stories, again, you can see how there is slight differences even in the similar shades. That's down to the formula differences. That happens when you're changing around the pigments. So that totally makes sense. I do wish that they had brought forward those 6 shades that are from the OG palette, and I can kind of see her doing that. I can see her doing that. I can see her maybe coming out with like a 5-pan, a 6-pan palette, because she does this quite a bit, to go with these midi palettes. I love that there's obviously a big change in terms of the price. This was like 100 and something euro. It was crazy. Like I said, I've been a fan for ages, and this is like 60 something. This is where I say I'm an affiliate. You can use my code. You'll get 15% off. It's just my name, Teresa. Oh, there we go. Anyways, we've done that. But it's much better value for what you're getting. You don't get the same amount of product. But I mean, who's hitting pan? Who is hitting pan these days? Not me, because I have an insane makeup collection. But I definitely feel like you could see that this is elevated. This is more sophisticated than the original. I think they can definitely take the original and kind of rejuvenate it somewhat, bring in those extra shades. But I love that she didn't do a copy paste either. I think that was actually very, very smart. But yeah, if you have the original one, do you necessarily need this new one? I don't think you do. You don't. But if you're like me and you're a Natasha fan, yeah, you're probably going to get it anyway, one way or the other. If you have been looking at this and wondering what the story is in terms of the formula, that's what's going on. It's very light, it's very buildable, very, very workable. Again, one of the things that she has with her palettes is that you can kind of remove the pans, you can rearrange them. If you have existing Natasha palettes, you can mix and match. You can create your own palette, which I think is very, very smart. So all in all, I think it's really, really great. I love seeing a rejuvenation, sort of like a nostalgic callback. It's very, very nice. But my gorgeous friends, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Do please like, comment and subscribe. Turn on that notification bell. And do please share, because sharing is caring, except of course for STDs, in which case, just wrap it up. Don't be gross. But that's it. That's the end of the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.